All right, diving right in, today we're tackling your question about the whole philosophy behind a liberal arts education.
Ooh, that's a good one.
Yeah, it's a big one, right? And we've actually got 3 sources to help us out here.
Okay.
2 videos, one on Aristotle, one on Plato.
Classic.
Classics, right? And then this really fascinating article, I think you'll like this, about how the Renaissance kind of brought those ideas back to life in a way.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So fair warning, Aristotle and Plato, they can be a little dense, a little tough to get through sometimes.
Yeah.
But that's why you've got us. We're going to break it down, make it fun, hopefully, make it make sense.
Absolutely. Always happy to dust off these classic texts.
Exactly. So let's just jump right in. Aristotle.
Okay.
He's the one who, a lot of people say, he's the one who really kind of brought this idea of liberal education into being.
Right.
But what did he actually mean by that?
Right.
It wasn't just like, go to school so you can get a job.
Yeah. No, absolutely not. I mean, for Aristotle, that liberal part, it really meant like education for people who are free. Not necessarily free from work, but like free to just like develop themselves, reach their full potential.
Oh, okay.
And that's what he believed led to happiness.
Happiness. Wait, so like is college just a 4-year happiness course?
Well, not exactly. It's a bit more complicated than that.
Okay.
Aristotle wasn't talking about just like, feeling good all the time or like fleeting happiness. He was talking about eudaimonia. Eudaimonia, yeah, it's often translated as happiness, but it's more about like flourishing or living well. Like imagine someone who's not just successful in their career, but they're also like fulfilled, connected to others, and living by their values. Like that's the kind of person Aristotle had in mind.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. But how do you get there, right?
Right.
Like how does studying all this stuff lead to that kind of deep, fulfilling life?
Well, for Aristotle, it all goes back to human nature. He saw humans as rational animals, meaning like what sets us apart is our ability to reason. So education should then like cultivate that ability, help us think clearly, make good decisions, and eventually act virtuously.
So it's not just about like memorizing facts or something.
Yeah,
it's about learning how to actually like think for yourself and make good choices.
Exactly. And for him, those virtuous actions, based on knowledge and habit, those are what lead to eudaimonia, that flourishing life.
Okay, yeah, I'm starting to see how like maybe those late night philosophy debates in college weren't a total waste of time.
Right.
But what about Plato? How did he see this whole education thing?
Well, Plato, much like Aristotle, he really believed in the power of education.
Okay.
To shape people, shape society. And he gave us this really powerful metaphor for it. It's called the allegory of the cave.
The cave. Okay. Yeah, for those who haven't gone spelunking into Plato's cave yet.
Yeah.
Can you give us the quick tour?
Yeah, sure. So picture this. You've got prisoners chained up inside a cave their whole lives, and all they ever see are these shadows, right? On the wall, projected from, things passing by outside. And they think those shadows, that's reality.
Wow. That's kind of like how we can get stuck in our own little bubbles today, right?
Yeah.
Just seeing what we want to see, not the whole picture.
Yeah, that's a great connection. So then one of these prisoners, he escapes. He gets out of the cave.
Okay.
And at first, he's blinded by the sunlight. It's so bright. But then he starts to see the world as it really is. He sees the objects that were making their shadows. And then he sees the sun itself, which represents, like, true knowledge,
Oh, wow.
And that whole journey, getting out of that cave, it symbolizes that struggle to become enlightened, to see past just appearances and get to a real understanding.
So for Plato, education is like breaking free from those chains, those mental chains.
Yeah.
And searching for truth.
Yeah.
Even if it's like hard or uncomfortable.
Exactly. It's all about questioning your assumptions, confronting things that maybe you don't want to see, and always trying to understand more about the world, about yourself, everything.
So that feeling you get when like a book or an idea totally shakes up your worldview,
Yeah.
that's actually a good thing, according to Plato.
Yeah. That means you're on the right track. You're pushing yourself to grow.
It's like when you travel to a new place and you realize, like, whoa, my way of seeing things isn't the only way.
That's a great example. Travel, just like a good liberal arts education, can really push you out of your comfort zone, expose you to new ideas, new ways of thinking.
Okay, I'm liking this, but hold on. Did Aristotle and Plato have any like specific ideas about what subjects people should study to reach this enlightenment? Like, was there a curriculum for happiness so to speak?
Well, they both had some pretty strong opinions about that.
Okay.
You might be surprised to hear that math was huge for Plato.
Math? Really?
Yeah.
I always thought math and liberal arts were like total opposites.
Yeah, that's a common misconception. See, for Plato, math wasn't about just like crunching numbers.
Okay.
It was about training your mind to think abstractly, logically, getting you ready for the highest form of knowledge, which he called dialectic. Dialectic, yeah.
Sounds intense.
It is. It's all about like rigorous argumentation, questioning everything, aiming for that like big picture view.
So it's not just about knowing the right answers, it's about knowing how to think critically. Like we're doing now, I guess.
Exactly.
Whoa, meta. We're not just talking philosophy, we're doing it. But before we get too philosophical here, I'm curious about how these ancient Greek ideas, how do they actually make their way into like our modern idea of what a liberal arts education is? That's where our article about the Renaissance comes in, right?
Yeah, exactly. Fast forward a few centuries, and we see this like revival of these classical ideals, especially in Europe during the Italian Renaissance.
So like they just dusted off their copies of Aristotle and Plato and picked up where they left off.
Well, not exactly. They definitely drew inspiration from the classics, but there were some interesting shifts, some new developments that happened. During the Renaissance, this new educational program popped up called Studia Humanitatis.
Studia Humanitatis.
Studia Humanitatis. Yeah, and it focused on things like grammar, rhetoric, history, poetry, and moral philosophy.
Sounds kind of like a secret society or something.
Right.
But those subjects, they sound pretty familiar. Like that's basically what we think of as the core of liberal arts today, right?
You got it. But there's a subtle but important shift happening here.
Okay.
The Renaissance humanists, they put more emphasis on human potential and civic virtue. So education, for them, it became less about preparing for the afterlife and more about like empowering people to be active in their communities and shape the world around them.
So less focus on religious stuff and more on creating like well-rounded citizens who could actually contribute to society.
Precisely. And one of the key figures in this shift was Cicero, the Roman orator and statesman. He became like the model for how to write and speak persuasively, which was seen as super important for leadership and civic engagement.
Makes sense. If you want to change the world, you got to be able to communicate your ideas, right?
Right.
That's a lesson that's still relevant today, no matter what you do.
Absolutely. Being able to express your thoughts clearly and convincingly is a valuable skill no matter what field you're in, whether you're writing a report, giving a presentation, or even just having a conversation.
So we've got Aristotle with his focus on virtue and flourishing, then Plato with his journey out of the cave, and then the Renaissance humanists who are all about civic virtue and good communication. It seems like there's a common thread running through all of these ideas, even across centuries. But, there's one thing that's kind of been bugging me.
What's that?
Well, both Aristotle and Plato, brilliant as they were also, products of their time.
Yeah.
And their views on education, they were, well, kind of elitist. Like they didn't really think everyone was capable of this kind of deep learning, did they?
Yeah, that's a really important point. And it's something we should definitely talk more about. It's great to talk about education for free individuals, but if only a select few actually have access to that kind of freedom, then, something's not quite right.
Exactly. It makes you wonder how those old assumptions about who deserves a liberal arts education, how are those still shaping things today?
That's a really good question, and one that I think we should definitely explore further.
Okay, so.
Yeah.
To be continued.
To be continued. It's kind of a funny thing to think about, isn't it? We're talking about education for free people, but then the very people who came up with that idea, well, they weren't exactly all about inclusivity, were they?
It really makes you think, like even the smartest people, they're still influenced by, the time they lived in. But I guess that's part of why it's so important to go back and read these old texts. They make us question our own assumptions and biases and see how those might be like limiting our understanding of things.
Exactly. And speaking of challenging assumptions, I think it's worth spending a little more time on Aristotle's idea of happiness as the ultimate goal of education. Because I think it's easy to like misunderstand what he meant, especially today.
Oh, yeah, for sure. If I told my students that the goal of my class was to make them happy, they'd probably show up expecting like pizza parties and no homework.
Exactly. But remember, Aristotle wasn't talking about that kind of, superficial, fleeting happiness. He was after something much deeper and more lasting.
So what do you think he meant then by connecting happiness to virtue?
Well, For Aristotle, virtue wasn't just about being good in some vague way. It was about developing specific character traits that help us function well as human beings, to live in a way that, aligns with our true nature. Traits like courage, justice, temperance, wisdom. These are the qualities that he believed allowed us to truly flourish.
It's almost like a recipe for a good life.
Precisely. Aristotle believed that by cultivating these virtues, we could achieve a state of eudaimonia. It's often translated as happiness, but it's more accurately understood as flourishing or living well. It's about, living in harmony with our true nature, fulfilling our potential as rational social beings.
That makes sense. But how does education, actually help us cultivate those virtues and reach that state of flourishing?
Well, Aristotle didn't believe that virtue was something we were born with. It was something we had to develop through practice, through habit. And education was the key to that whole process.
So it's not just about knowing what's right. It's about actually doing what's right consistently.
Exactly. Turning knowledge into action, into habit. And that's where the real challenge is, It's one thing to understand these ideas in your head, but it's another thing entirely to actually live them out in the real world.
It's kind of like that saying, knowledge is knowing that a tomato is a fruit, but wisdom is not putting it in a fruit salad.
Uh-huh. Exactly.
You can have all the knowledge in the world, but if you don't actually put it into practice, it's not going to do you much good.
I love that analogy.
Yeah.
And it really highlights the importance of that kind of holistic education that both Aristotle and Plato were pushing for. It's not just about filling our heads with facts. It's about shaping our character, refining our judgment, and really cultivating those habits of mind and heart that lead to a truly fulfilling life.
It's funny. We always talk about the real world like it's a separate thing from education, like something you enter after you graduate.
Yeah.
But what if education is actually the best preparation for the real world?
That's a great point. And I think both Aristotle and Plato would agree with you. They saw education as this lifelong journey of learning and growth, something that keeps going long after we leave school. And it's that growth, that ability to learn and adapt that lets us navigate all the complexities of life and really make a difference in the world.
I want to go back to Plato's cave for a minute. There's this one part of the story that we haven't really talked about yet, and I think it's really important.
You mean the prisoner who escapes and sees the world as it truly is?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
He has this incredible life-changing experience, sees the sun, grasps the form of the good,
yeah,
achieves enlightenment.
Exactly. A moment of true intellectual and spiritual awakening.
There's dim.
Yeah.
Then he goes back down into the cave. He tries to share what he's learned with the other prisoners, and that's what gets me.
Yep.
Why would he do that? He knows it's going to be hard, maybe even dangerous. The other prisoners might not believe him, might even reject him.
And yet he goes back anyway. Why do you think that is? What do you think it tells us about, the nature of true knowledge, of enlightenment?
That's a good question. I guess it suggests that, true knowledge is not meant to be kept secret or hoarded. Mm-hmm. It's meant to be shared, mm-hmm. to help others break free from their own mental chains.
Exactly. And that's where things get really interesting, right? Because sharing knowledge, well, it's rarely easy. How do you explain something as complex as the form of the good to someone who's only ever seen shadows? How do you bridge that gap in understanding?
Yeah, it's like trying to describe the internet to someone who lived in the 1800s. Where would you even start?
Exactly. And I think the allegory really highlights the challenges that come with trying to share these really profound truths with people who might not be ready to hear them.
It's a tricky balance, right? You want to share what you've learned, but you also have to respect other people's beliefs, even when those beliefs seem, limited or maybe even wrong.
And sometimes those beliefs are really deeply rooted. Think about how those prisoners in the cave might react to their friend coming back with this wild story. They might think he's lost it. They might even try to shut him up.
It makes you wonder how many people throughout history, people who tried to speak truth, how many of them were silenced because their ideas were just too challenging, too disruptive?
It's a sobering thought, and it reminds us that the pursuit of knowledge can be risky, even dangerous sometimes. But it also highlights how important it is to have the courage to speak truth to power, even when it's uncomfortable.
And to be willing to listen to those truths, even when they challenge our own comfortable assumptions.
Exactly. And I think that's what a liberal arts education at its best can help us do. It gives us the tools to think critically, to engage with complex ideas, and to have those difficult conversations in a way that's both meaningful and respectful.
So it's not just about what you know, it's about how you use that knowledge.
Right. Precisely. And part of that wisdom is understanding how to use language, how to use rhetoric to persuade, to inspire, to create change.
Speaking of rhetoric, I want to shift gears for a second and touch on something that might seem a little out of place in a conversation about, philosophy and education.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
Well, remember how we talked about the revival of rhetoric during the Renaissance? How Cicero became like the go-to guy for all things persuasive and eloquent?
Yes, I remember that quite well, but what's the unexpected connection?
Well, it's about the practical side of a liberal arts education. During the Renaissance, being a skilled rhetorician, it wasn't just an academic pursuit, it was a way to, move up in the world.
Ah, I see where you're going with this.
Yeah, for ambitious young men back then, mastering rhetoric opened doors to careers in law, politics, diplomacy, all these influential fields. It was a way to climb the social ladder, gain power and prestige.
That's a really interesting point. It shows that a liberal arts education has always had this dual nature, hasn't it? It's about intellectual development, sure, but it's also about giving people the skills and knowledge they need to succeed in the world.
And honestly, that's still a big reason why people choose to study liberal arts today,
Right.
right? It's not just about learning, it's about opportunity.
That's definitely true. But I think it's important to remember that those two goals, they aren't mutually exclusive. In fact, I'd argue that they're deeply connected. A mind that's open to new ideas, that can think critically and communicate effectively well, that's a mind that can solve problems, that can innovate, that can lead. And those are the qualities that employers look for, that societies need.
So it's like a win-win situation.
Exactly. A liberal arts education can be both personally enriching and professionally advantageous. It's about developing your full potential as a human being while also preparing you to make a real difference in the world.
I love how this conversation has come full circle. We started with Aristotle's idea of education for free people, and now we're talking about the freedom and flexibility that a liberal arts education can give you. Freedom to explore your passions, develop your talents, and really create your own path in the world.
And maybe, in a way, that's the most lasting contribution of the ancient Greeks and the Renaissance humanists. They reminded us that education isn't just about acquiring information or skills, it's about becoming the kind of person you want to be.
That's a powerful thought. It is not just what you know, it's who you become. But on that note, I think it's time to take a little break and shift gears a bit. We've talked a lot about the potential benefits of a liberal arts education, but, let's be real. It's not all perfect. There's some valid criticisms out there too.
You're absolutely right, and I think it's important that we acknowledge those criticisms and really engage with them honestly. After all, as we've been saying, critical thinking is at the very heart of a liberal arts education.
Exactly. So when we come back, let's dive into some of those counter arguments and see what we can learn from them. All right, so let's get into some of those criticisms of a liberal arts education. I think the big one you always hear is that a liberal arts degree just isn't, practical. It doesn't prepare you for the real world.
Yeah, that's definitely a common one. And I think it comes from a fundamental misunderstanding of what a liberal arts education really is. It's not just about, abstract ideas or useless knowledge.
So what is it about then? What are people missing?
It's about transferable skills, developing these habits of mind that are valuable no matter what you end up doing. Remember how Aristotle talked about virtuous activity? Those virtues, courage, justice, wisdom, they translate into real-world skills. Critical thinking, ethical decision-making, communication.
So it's not just about learning what to think, but learning how to think.
Exactly. And those skills, they're in high demand. Employers, they want people who can solve problems, analyze information, communicate clearly, and work well with others. And a liberal arts education, it cultivates those very skills.
Interesting. So it's not just about the specific classes you take, but how those classes train your brain to approach challenges.
Right. And don't forget adaptability. The world's changing so fast these days. The ability to learn new things quickly, to be flexible, open to new ideas, that's essential. And that's something a liberal arts education really emphasizes.
Yeah, like that saying, the only constant is change.
Yeah.
Right? If you can adapt, you're going to be much better off no matter what happens.
Absolutely. And there's actually data to support this. Studies have shown that people with liberal arts degrees, they actually tend to earn more over their lifetimes than people who just focused on like vocational training. It might take a little longer to get going, but those critical thinking and communication skills, they really pay off down the road.
Huh. So this whole liberal arts degrees are useless thing, that's more of a myth than a fact.
It's definitely a misconception. But, there is another criticism that I think is a little more valid. And it's something that a lot of schools are actually working on addressing.
What's that?
It's the argument that a liberal arts education, especially the way it's traditionally been taught, can be too focused on, like, the Western canon, too limited in terms of representing diverse voices and perspectives.
Yeah, that's a good point. If we're talking about education for free people, then it needs to be accessible and relevant to everyone, right? Not just like one specific group.
Exactly. And that means actively expanding the curriculum, challenging those traditional canons, and making space for a wider range of voices and perspectives. It's about acknowledging that there are multiple ways of seeing the world, and that a truly well-rounded education should include all of those different viewpoints.
It's like with Plato's cave, right? We all start with limited perspectives. But the goal is to help each other break free from those limitations, create a world where everyone has the chance to see things in new ways.
That's a really great way to put it, and it speaks to the transformative potential of a truly inclusive and equitable liberal arts education. It's not just about, individual growth. It's about building a more just and compassionate world.
It makes me think about how much richer my own understanding of like history and literature became when I started reading authors and thinkers from different cultures and backgrounds. It opened up whole new ways of thinking and experiencing the world.
Absolutely. And that's what's so exciting about the future of liberal arts education. It's constantly evolving, being challenged and reshaped to better reflect the world we live in.
Well, this has been a really fascinating conversation. From ancient Greece to the Renaissance and beyond, we've covered a lot of ground, unpacked some big ideas, tackled some tough questions, and hopefully given our listener a better understanding of what a liberal arts education is really all about.
It's been a pleasure exploring these ideas with you.
And to our listener, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We encourage you to keep exploring these ideas, challenging your own assumptions, and embracing the power of learning. Because as we've seen, a liberal arts education isn't just about getting a degree. It's about developing your mind, your character, and your ability to make a real difference in the world.
And who knows? You might even find yourself escaping from your own intellectual cave along the way.
Until next time, keep those minds open and keep exploring.